The antique shop stood at the corner of the street, like a relic from another time, its faded sign creaking softly in the winter wind. Lydia had passed it a dozen times before, but something about the way the sunlight caught the frosted window pane today drew her in. A bell tinkled faintly as she pushed open the heavy wooden door, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the dense, quiet air inside. The place smelled of old wood, forgotten stories, and something faintly metallic that she couldn't quite place. Shelves groaned under the weight of cluttered curiosities, tarnished candlesticks, porcelain dolls with cracked faces, and books so aged their titles had vanished into the leather. The dim lighting seemed to thicken the shadows, and Lydia felt as though she had stepped into another world entirely. Looking for something special? The voice startled her. From behind a cluttered counter emerged the shopkeeper, a wiry man with gray hair swept back as if the wind had frozen it mid-blow. His eyes gleamed with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, but his smile was warm enough. "Just browsing," Lydia said quickly, her hands jammed into her coat pockets. The shopkeeper nodded, retreating to his stool like a bird returning to its perch. "Take your time. Sometimes the right thing finds you." The words lingered in her mind as she wandered deeper into the shop, her fingers brushing against faded spines and cool brass. Her gaze drifted to a glass case near the back of the store, where an ornate pocket watch lay nestled among other forgotten treasures. The watch gleamed even in the dim light, its surface polished to an unnatural shine. Lydia crouched to get a better look. It wasn't large, but its presence was magnetic. The case was etched with swirling patterns that seemed to shift the longer she stared, drawing her eyes toward the tiny inscription on its back. "For time borrowed, not owned." "That's quite a piece," the shopkeeper said, appearing at her elbow without a sound. "Late 1800s, I'd wager. Belonged to a man who fancied himself a collector of rare things. Strange fellow, or so they said." Lydia hesitated. "Strange how?" The shopkeeper's smile tightened. "He disappeared, they say, left behind nothing but a room full of oddities. That watch was the crown jewel." The words unsettled her, but not enough to dull her curiosity. "How much?" "50, he said after a pause. "I'll even throw in a box to keep it safe." Lydia paid, unsure why she felt compelled to do so. As she stepped back into the cold air, clutching the watch in its velvet-lined box, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her as much as she was watching it. It started small. The night Lydia brought the pocket watch home, she set it on her nightstand and promptly forgot about it. The day had been exhausting, and she fell into bed with a sigh, her limbs heavy with fatigue. As sleep tugged at her, she thought she heard a faint ticking, soft and insistent, like a heartbeat muffled by layers of cloth. When she woke the next morning, the watch had moved. It sat precisely in the middle of her desk, its chain coiled neatly beside it. Lydia frowned. She hadn't touched it since placing it on her nightstand the night before. Maybe she'd absent-mindedly moved it. She shook the thought away and got on with her day, but a faint unease followed her, clinging like a shadow. By the third day, the ticking grew louder. She carried the watch with her to work, intending to show it off to her colleague Zoe, who loved antiques. But when she pulled it from her bag at lunch, Zoe froze. "Where did you get that?" Zoe asked, her voice unusually sharp. "An antique shop downtown," Lydia said. "Why?" Zoe hesitated, her gaze fixed on the watch. "I've seen one like it before. My grandmother used to have a pocket watch that looked just like that. She always said it was cursed, something about it showing the wrong time, but only for her." Lydia laughed uneasily. "It's just a watch." "Maybe," Zoe said, but she didn't touch it. That night, Lydia couldn't sleep. The ticking was louder than ever, a steady rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo in her chest. She got up and crossed the room to the desk where the watch sat. Its face gleamed faintly in the dark, the hands pointing to a time that didn't make sense. 11:47. She glanced at the clock on her phone. 3:12 a.m. Frowning, she picked up the watch. The ticking stopped instantly. Lydia froze, her breath catching in her throat. The silence was deafening, almost suffocating. As she turned the watch over in her hands, she noticed something strange in its polished surface. A faint reflection, not of her bedroom, but of a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the watch, the reflection was gone. But the ticking had started again, louder than ever, as if mocking her disbelief. Her unease had shifted to something colder, sharper, dread. The ticking followed Lydia everywhere. By the end of the week, it had seeped into every corner of her life. Whether she was at work, grocery shopping, or sitting quietly in her apartment, she could hear it, constant, relentless, and growing louder by the day. It was no longer just sound. It was a presence, heavy and oppressive. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just a trick of her mind. Stress, maybe. But then came the dreams. They began innocuously, fragments of unfamiliar places and faces. Lydia would wake with a vague sense of unease, the details slipping away like smoke. But soon, the dreams became vivid, saturated with sights, smells, and sounds that felt far too real. She dreamed of a man she had never met. He stood in a dimly lit study, his back to her as he worked at a desk cluttered with books and papers. The air around him felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. He murmured to himself, his words indistinct, yet tinged with desperation. On the desk sat the watch, its ticking blending seamlessly with the rapid scratching of his pen. Lydia tried to speak, to call out to him, but the moment she opened her mouth, the scene shifted. She found herself in a shadowy corridor, its walls lined with distorted mirrors. Her reflection stared back at her from each surface, except it wasn't her. The eyes were wrong, sunken and empty, as if they belonged to someone long dead. She woke drenched in sweat, the ticking loud in her ears, even though the watch was tucked away in its box on her nightstand. Desperate for answers, Lydia began researching the watch's inscription. For time borrowed, not owned. She scoured books, online forums, and obscure websites, eventually stumbling upon a mention of an artifact fitting its description. A small community of collectors and historians whispered about a pocket watch said to contain the essence of its original owner, a man obsessed with immortality. Through threads and cryptic comments, Lydia pieced together a fragmented story. The watch had belonged to Elias Marwood, a recluse and scholar who had spent his life seeking a way to defy death. According to legend, Marwood had succeeded in binding a fragment of his soul to the watch, but at a terrible cost. The watch could never be destroyed, and anyone who possessed it would bear its burden, a lingering piece of Marwood's restless essence, tethered to their life like a parasite. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face as she read the accounts. The descriptions of the watch matched hers exactly. The shifting etchings, the unnatural ticking, the sense of being watched. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. It was Zoe. "You've been acting weird," Zoe said as soon as Lydia answered. "What's going on?" Lydia hesitated. "It's the watch. I think it's cursed." She heard Zoe sigh on the other end. "Lydia, it's just a pocket watch." "No," Lydia said, her voice trembling. "It's more than that. I don't know how to explain it, but I think it's alive." There was a long pause before Zoe replied, her voice quieter. "Okay, what can I do?" Lydia didn't know. All she knew was that the watch wasn't just an object. It was a link to something much darker. The next time Lydia held the watch, she felt it immediately. A pulse, faint but unmistakable, like a second heartbeat. She almost dropped it in shock, but her hands refused to let go. The ticking grew louder, blending into a rhythmic vibration that traveled up her arms and settled in her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but the world around her seemed to ripple. When she opened them again, she wasn't in her apartment anymore. She stood in the study from her dreams. The room was dimly lit by the flickering glow of a single lamp. Papers and books were scattered across the desk, their edges curling as if they had been there for decades. The air smelled of ink and mildew, and the faint ticking of the watch filled the room, harmonizing with the sound of her own ragged breaths. A figure moved in the corner, and Lydia's stomach clenched. It was the man from her dreams, Elias Marwood. His presence was commanding, yet fragile, as though he were both there and not there. He turned slowly, his face pale and drawn, his eyes sunken and filled with something Lydia couldn't name. "Why do you carry my burden?" he asked, his voice low and echoing, as if it came from the walls rather than his mouth. "I didn't mean to," Lydia whispered, her words catching in her throat. I didn't know." Marwood's gaze bore into her, heavy with an emotion that felt like sorrow. "Time is a cruel master," he said, "and I have borrowed more than my share." The room darkened, and Lydia felt a wave of dizziness. Flashes of Marwood's life filled her mind, his obsessive studies, the rituals, the moment he etched his soul into the watch with trembling hands. She felt his regret, his desperation, his loneliness. "Set me free," he murmured. The words echoed as the study dissolved around her, the dim light fading into nothingness. Lydia gasped as she found herself back in her apartment, the watch still in her hands. Its ticking was softer now, almost subdued, but the weight of Marwood's plea hung heavy in the air. She knew what she had to do. But as she glanced at the watch, its gleaming surface reflected her face, and something else, lurking just behind her. Lydia sat on the edge of her bed, the watch cradled in her trembling hands. Its ticking was no longer relentless, but slower, each beat deliberate and resonant, like a dying breath. The air in the room had grown colder, the faint scent of ink and mildew lingering like a ghost. Marwood's plea echoed in her mind. "Set me free." But how? Her laptop lay open on the desk, the dim light from the screen illuminating fragments of her frantic search. Threads about rituals, legends, and the obscure process of releasing a bound soul had led her to a single possibility, a ceremonial unbinding. It required the presence of the watch, a mirror, and a deliberate acknowledgement of its purpose. The instructions were sparse, riddled with warnings of failure and ambiguity about what might happen next. The clock on her wall read 11:32 p.m. Midnight loomed. Lydia's reflection in the laptop screen looked hollow, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. But this was her chance to break free, not just for herself, but for the fragment of Elias Marwood, tethered to the watch like an anchor to the ocean floor. She arranged the mirror on the floor in the center of her living room, its reflective surface catching the flicker of her desk lamp. The watch sat atop the mirror, its chain coiled like a serpent. As Lydia knelt before it, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in the room were watching her. They stretched unnaturally across the walls, their edges sharp and deliberate. The first words of the ritual felt strange on her tongue, the syllables thick and foreign. The online guide had warned that the process might awaken latent energy within the artifact, and as she spoke, she felt the room change. The air grew heavier, pressing against her chest, and the ticking of the watch grew louder, synchronized with her racing heartbeat. Then, the mirror began to ripple. At first, it was subtle, like a pool disturbed by the faintest breeze. But the distortion grew, and soon, the reflection shifted entirely, no longer showing Lydia or the room around her. Instead, it revealed a study bathed in shadow, the study from her dreams. Elias Marwood stood at the center, staring back at her through the mirror. His face was pale and spectral, his form flickering like a candle's flame. "You have opened the door," he said, his voice heavy with despair. "I'm trying to help you," Lydia said, her voice trembling. Marwood's gaze softened, his spectral figure stepping closer to the mirror's surface. "You carry my burden well, but it is not yours to bear. Let me take it back." Lydia hesitated. The words of the ritual whispered in her mind, urging her to finish. But as Marwood reached toward her, his hand ghosting the edge of the mirror, the shadows in the room shifted again. They weren't still anymore. They writhed, twisting like serpents, their edges creeping closer to the circle of light surrounding Lydia and the mirror. The ticking of the watch grew erratic, its rhythm breaking into sharp, staccato bursts. "You must act now," Marwood said, his voice rising. "They will come for you, as they came for me." Lydia's heart pounded as the shadows closed in, their movements deliberate and menacing. She felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her, each breath harder to draw. With shaking hands, she grasped the watch and held it over the mirror. The reflection shimmered violently, the study flickering like a broken projection. "Time is borrowed," she whispered, the words forming unbidden on her lips. "Not owned." The watch grew hot in her hands, the etchings on its surface glowing faintly. The light spread, spilling into the mirror and consuming the image of Marwood's study. He stepped closer, his form almost touching hers through the thin barrier of glass. "Finish it," he urged. Summoning every ounce of resolve, Lydia spoke the final words of the ritual. The mirror shattered. For a moment, the world was silent. Then, the shards on the floor began to dissolve, each fragment turning to dust and vanishing into the air. The watch, still in her hand, fell silent, its ticking ceasing, as though its very essence had been extinguished. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, and the shadows retreated, melting into the corners of the apartment. Lydia exhaled, her hands trembling as she set the watch down. Its surface was cold now, lifeless. She stared at it, waiting for the ticking to return, but the only sound was her own unsteady breathing. The night stretched on in silence. When dawn broke, Lydia sat by the window, the first rays of sunlight warming her face. The watch lay on the coffee table, an inert relic of a haunting chapter she was desperate to leave behind. As she reached for her coffee, the faintest sound caught her ear, a single soft tick. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. But it never came again.